Hi guys, welcome to another episode of the Iraqi Nutrition Podcast. I'm your host Juma Iraqi, and today I have a very special guest with me, Professor Stuart Phillips. Stu, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thanks Juma. Thanks for having me on the show.
It's my pleasure. I've been wanting to get you on the podcast for quite a while now, so finally I got the chance to bring you on. So today's topic is sarcopenia, so we're going to go through a couple of questions regarding that topic. But before we start, could you give the listeners an introduction about yourself?
Sure. I'm a professor in the Department of Kinesiology here at McMaster University. That's located in Hamilton, probably about, I would say, 45 kilometers outside of Toronto. So it's a little bit cool here today, but I think like a lot of people in the Northern Hemisphere, we've had a pretty mild winter, so not too bad.
Yeah. So what areas of research would you say are your expertise?
Yeah, I think when I tell people about that, we put skeletal muscle squarely in the middle. We look at what different types of variables affect skeletal muscle. That might be resistance exercise or other types of exercise. And we look at the turnover of muscle protein. So we look at the impact of exercise and nutrition, mostly around protein, and the interaction of those two and how they affect muscle.
Okay, perfect. And I also understand that you're a big fan of rugby. Is that correct?
Yeah. In another life, in a much younger part of my life, I was a big fan of rugby, played it a lot. Then I coached it for several years. Don't have as much to do with it now, but if I were to rank sports, and I say this even as a Canadian, it would still be my favorite sport. So
okay, excellent.
Ice hockey is a close second, though. So
yeah. I think you're obligated to say that since you're Canadian.
Exactly. Yeah. Otherwise, I think we get kicked out. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Okay. So to get the question started, could you please explain what sarcopenia is and what causes it?
Yeah. So sarcopenia was a term defined by Erwin Rosenberg, who was at Tufts University at the time, and the original definition centered around, and I think a lot of people still use this, loss of skeletal muscle mass with aging. The more recent updated definitions include a component of skeletal muscle mass loss, but also something to do with skeletal muscle mass function. And more traditionally now, it's defined as a combination of a low gait speed, so a slow walking speed, and usually hand grip strength. And I think they've reverted to hand grip strength because it's just convenient to measure that in a clinician's office. So it's usually a combination of those things. And obviously, those are going to decline with age, but some people are on a more rapid decline and so enter a stage of what's known as sarcopenia, maybe a little bit earlier in life. But I think it's probably inevitable for somebody at some point to experience some degree of this. How it arises, I think it's an open question. There probably is not one or another cause, although it can be accelerated by inactivity. I think, though, it's fair to say that it doesn't matter what species you look at, as they age, everything becomes more inactive. So humans are in that same category, but you can preserve it, I think, or slow the rate of decline with activity. So that's pretty potent. Inflammation is probably a big issue for some people, but I think that goes hand in hand with inactivity. Diabetes, lots of inflammatory diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, or limited mobility. It's hard to know what comes first in that situation, but anything where you become less active or the less you choose to do, then I think that the rate of sarcopenia would be accelerated. But there's probably multiple causes as well as some program of cellular aging that is going to contribute to it as well.
Okay, interesting. Now, how early will you start to see this age-related decline in muscle mass?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I So I think we borrow a lot from large cohort observational data where they have good body composition, and we sort of say, well, it probably starts in your 50s or maybe your 40s. I'm of the opinion, however, that if you're a particularly inactive, even 30-year-old, you can begin to see declines in muscle mass. So you can imagine if somebody's growing up to around the age of about 18, they would sort of stay stable into their 20s. And then if they don't do much in their 30s, I think you could start to see loss of muscle and some degree of weakness. Most people do enough to sort of offset that into their 50s. And I want to say, and I always joke, I say, every year older I get, of course, it pushes back by another year. But so at this point, squarely at the age of about 51, it starts. And next year it'll be 52. So,
Okay.
but I think that that there's some good evidence from cohort studies of people who practice, not maybe the runners, but who some component of resistive work, that they hang on to their strength. But even masters, weightlifters, obviously, their muscle and their strength goes down. So something's happening that, age is going to get you. There's no question.
Okay. Do we have any numbers of how much, like in percentages, how much muscle mass you can experience annually?
Yeah, the nuclear sort of number that gets quoted is around 1% of loss of your muscle per year. Strength is a much greater loss depending on where you are. They say somewhere between 1 to 3%. That's probably an indication that strength has a neural component to it. So loss not just of muscle mass, so fiber size, but the actual number of muscle fibers and the nerves that are innervating those fibers. So I think that 1% and 1 to 3% for strength are the usual numbers that are cited. Again, there's tremendous individual variability. You can find people who from year to year lose very little muscle, and then other people, and particularly if they're sick, something knocks them back in a year. Cancer is an example, or the onset of osteoarthritis can really result in a more precipitous decline.
Okay, excellent. Now, any other diseases that can also affect the losses of muscle mass?
Well, like I said, anything that affects mobility, so osteoarthritis and all of the inflammatory conditions around rheumatoid arthritis. But we talk about conditions like type 2 diabetes being prevalent. We could talk about cardiovascular disease, particularly peripheral vascular disease. I think there are certain types of cancers that are very aggressive in terms of how they manifest, and they do result in an accelerated muscle loss. But any type of sickness where somebody would spend an extended period of time not doing too much. If they're in bed, definitely. We know bed rest is a tremendously catabolic condition, or anti-anabolic, however you want to phrase it. But anything that makes people inactive would accelerate that decline for sure.
Okay. Now, what type of exercises are we talking about here that can be beneficial? And if we're talking about the elderly population, that would be easy for them to perform.
Yeah. So I think this is a situation where it's fairly clear that the loading exercises, resistive exercise, is king in terms of offsetting the decline. It's not that the aerobic component of cycling or walking doesn't have a loading component to it. Of course it does, and in that situation then it would be, if you like, anti-catabolic. But I think that the loading exercises are far more effective in that regard. So it really comes down to trying to find a loading routine, whether that's within a gym environment or even within the built environment itself. Stair climbing, for example, is something that involves a little bit more of a push-off and a workout for the legs. Doesn't do much for the upper body, I agree, but anything like that I think an older person can sort of engage in and stick with. And I'm talking about people probably into their 70s now. I'm again using the new definition of old, and that is to say that we used to say old was 65 or over, but the length of people's lives these days, lifespan, and Scandinavia is kind of leading in that category, along with obviously Japan being the top. But if people are living into their mid 80s on average, then 65 it's not old anymore. It's definitely older. But people in Canada now, the retirement age is creeping up and above 65. We have no mandatory retirement, so we're talking about people into their 70s, and this is where we people who study what they call geroscience or aging begin to see one condition show up, and then unfortunately, what the literature tells us is one chronic condition tends to beget one or another. So it's not like you have one. If you have one, you're pretty rare, but once you've got one, then you tend to get another, then you tend to get another. And this condition of multimorbidity is really a hot topic in geroscience, and how to prevent that, because these things, for reasons we don't fully understand, they tend to cluster together.
Mm-hmm. Now, in regards to like traditional resistance training, some elderly might be afraid to engage in that because they might have some issues with joint problems. Is there a better protocol that they could use, like comparing, for example, if they used higher repetitions and work to failure compared to using higher loads and using lower repetitions?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that the best program out there is clearly one that somebody will do. Mm-hmm. I think we can all agree on that. So then I think in between it becomes a little nuanced about what is the best program. I think that there's enough good evidence to suggest that lower weights, and in other words, if you want to put it as a percentage of 1RM, even as low as sort of 50 to 60%, they don't necessarily have to be heavier, although that's fine. And it really comes down to a matter of sustaining, obviously, the practice of weightlifting, lifting to a fair degree of effort. I think, the outward manifestation of fatigue, obviously, at the top level is, what's your effort on a Borg scale, for example. Mm-hmm. And people would say, oh, I'm at a 19 out of 20. I can't do any more. And I'm like, does it need to be at 19? Probably not. The center that I direct here, where we have 370 community members, average age of about 72 years, we're a constant user of the Borg rating of perceived exertion for people to guide their effort that they put out in a resistance exercise activity. We use it frequently only because we think that that's the best way to try and guide people. Not that people in the gym couldn't be very prescriptive, obviously, they can. But again, we're talking about a much sort of broader answer to the question. So lots of programs work, quote unquote. What works best, I think it would depend on what you choose to look at as the outcome. If you want older people to lift, Atlas stones or, do superhuman feats of strength, then by all means they have to lift heavy stuff. But I think that there's lots of benefits to be gained with just practice of a regular resistance exercise program of a number of different types. So,
yeah, excellent. I'll have to agree on that. Now, a bit more on nutrition. I understand that the RDA in the United States and Canada, it's at 0.8 grams per kilogram.
Yeah.
Do you think that it's set too low? And what if you are, what would you say would be more optimal values to aim for?
Yeah, so terrific question. I mean, I think that anybody that's read some of the stuff that our group has written here, we're big advocates of the fact that we do think the RDA for older people is too low. I think there's something even with the current RDA that a lot of people they've just sort of skimmed over the surface, and that is if you go back to the original data that was used to set the RDA and you look at the percentage of data points that came from older people, if it's studies or individual data points, it's no more than about 5% of the data points. And in each of those situations, when you compare those older subjects to the younger subjects, there's an increase between 10 to 30%. So even the data that sets the RDA would argue that the older population requires more protein. So, we're beginning to accumulate evidence, not just from nitrogen balance studies, but some very, very elegant methodologies. And a fellow named Paul Pencharts at the University of Toronto, one of his students, Raja Longo, who's now out at the University of British Columbia, are using what's called the indicator amino acid oxidation method, and they're coming up with numbers for older people that are much higher than the RDA. So recent consensus statements, again, by groups of individuals that are geriatricians, geroscientists, nutritionists, would peg at least, I think, a minimum intake for older people at least 1 to 1.2 grams per kilo per day. I think that there are benefits associated with greater intakes, but I do appreciate a number of things that might force people to eat less. First, protein. It's not the cheapest of macronutrients. And if you're an older person on a fixed income, I understand. I still talk about nutrient-dense sources of protein, so eggs, dairy, and meat as being very good contributors to other nutrients aside from protein. And when we talk about the satiety value of protein, I think we have to acknowledge that protein makes you feel full. It makes you want to stop eating. And if you're an older person and maybe you're not eating much because your appetite's reduced, sometimes a message about a lot of protein is not maybe the best thing for that person. So I'd acknowledge all of those things. But I do think we're beginning to generate a body of evidence now, which is becoming more difficult to ignore, around the actual need to make a specific recommendation for older people. And the fact I point out to lots of people is, well, older people are, and they used to say this, well, I'm saying, well, actually, they're a pretty big segment of society now, not just here in North America, but all over Europe, and obviously global aging is a huge phenomenon. And we've added 30 plus years to our life expectancy in the last century. So that's not going to go away. We're going to have to deal with that. And obviously, maintaining muscle and being mobile, I think, is a crucial part of aging successfully, if you like.
Excellent. Actually, here in Norway, our recommendations are actually the numbers that you mentioned. We have general recommendations for the population at 1.1 grams of protein per kilogram, but elderly are recommended to consume 1.2 grams per day. And that actually
never let it be said that the Norwegians and the Scandinavian countries in general weren't further ahead. So
yeah. Another question is, there's a term that's often mentioned in the research when we were talking about the elderly population and protein, and that is anabolic resistance. Could you please explain what we are talking about?
Yeah, so anabolic resistance, and I think we can squarely credit Professor Mike Rennie with the origin of that term, really speaks to the fact that at a given dose of protein, the response of muscle protein synthesis in particular would be, let's say it's 100 units in a younger person, whereas an older person for that same dose and matched for body weight and everything else would only have a response of, let's say, 50 units. So they're resistant, if you like, to the effects of the normal or a given dose of protein in terms of their ability to be able to synthesize new proteins. So that's how we would traditionally, I think, define anabolic resistance. Obviously, it has links to insulin resistance, but they're the different types of concepts, if you like. So that would be the kind of nuclear definition, I think.
Okay. I know there's been a lot more focus as well on not only total amount of protein that you consume during the day, but per meal recommendation and how you distribute it during the day. So what would be optimal recommendations to give for this population in regards to that?
Yeah, so the rationale for a per meal recommendation really recognizes something, and I think you really have to go back to basics biochemistry and remember carbohydrates and fats as macronutrients, we have a very good and effective mechanism to store those. Protein, on the other hand, because of the nitrogen group, you only can use it within a limited frame of time. If you don't use it within that frame of time, and by use I mean, synthesize it into proteins or turn it into something else, glucose perhaps, or use it for a biosynthetic pathway, and you have to do that within the time that basically you've consumed protein. So once you've eaten protein, 3 to 4 hours later, all of the amino acids from that protein are gone. They've been transformed to something else. They've been put into proteins. They've been turned into glucose. They've been turned into neurotransmitters. So that's a little different from carbohydrate and fat, and it's really that rationale that underpins why you would make a per meal recommendation as opposed to saying, well, it's not a big deal. You just got to get 0.8 grams per kilo per day. So, it always surprises me when people are a little bit, well, what do you mean it has to be per meal? I said, well, actually, it's pretty basic biochemical sense. So from that standpoint, and then realizing that the relationship between the utilization of protein and dose is essentially saturable. So it comes up and then plateaus off. You come to the conclusion that if older people are anabolically resistant, then they're going to need, on a per meal basis, more protein than a younger person. So I think that, again, it's not just our lab. We've done some work in this area, but Professor Luc Van Loon's lab, Blake Rasmussen's lab at University of Texas Medical Branch, and Phil Atherton, at the University of Nottingham, we all, I think, are pointing our data in the same direction. It's a per meal recommendation, tends to make sense, and it's higher for older people than it is for younger people.
Okay, excellent. What numbers are we talking about, if you can have something to compare the numbers?
Yeah, so so we've taken a stab at this, and it's been a retrospective analysis of our data that's given us these numbers. So what we generally say is around 0.25 grams of protein per kilo per meal is what a younger person, I think, plateaus the muscle response out. At the same time, an older person would be at about 0.4 grams of protein per kilogram per meal. So quite a bit higher, not quite double, but almost about 80% higher on a per meal basis. And again, that would go to the rationale of why you would recommend more protein on a daily basis. If you think about it and you want to make an optimal recommendation, then the idea would be to hit that per meal intake in 3 meals within a given day. So trying to get to that 1.2. So at 0.4, and this is why when we talk about the number, times 3 meals, that's where you arrive at 1.2. So I think that the recommendations are actually, the ones that you have at least, are spot on. I think they're right in line with what I would recommend.
Excellent. Now, in regards to protein quality, we're obviously talking about a number here. Are we talking about mixed meals, or are we talking about that you only consume the complete sources of protein?
Yeah, so if there's a limitation in giving any numbers, the ones that I've just given, it is to acknowledge exactly what you've just said. So all of the experiments where we've derived those numbers are from isolated protein sources. So I think when you begin to talk about a meal context where you've got carbohydrates and fats and you're eating actual real food, then things get a little, they're fuzzier for sure. And so, but if anything, then the recommendations would be to advocate for more protein in a mixed meal setting rather than isolated protein sources. So it's a good point, and one that gets brought up, and it's one that we're trying to address now with a slightly different method to measure muscle protein synthesis. Of course, the real outcome, the one that you want to show, is that there are changes in either muscle mass or something protein related that would be enhanced in terms of its synthetic rate, or more albumin, for example, would be a good outcome to show. But yeah, it's a good point. Likely more in a meal context. Tougher studies to do, more money, bigger sample sizes. Not much funding.
Yeah, I understand.
We're trying to get there.
Yeah, I understand. It's just that this is a question that often gets asked is, we're using isolated protein sources in the research that we do, and then we come with numbers, but we are giving recommendation with mixed meals. And one of the issues that I experience sometimes is I primarily work with athletes, and when they have a high caloric intake, especially from carbohydrate, they get a lot of the protein from from the carbohydrate sources. And I'll have an athlete sometimes eating a meal with a lot of bread and oatmeal and stuff, and he's already getting like 25-30 grams of protein in that meal from an incomplete source. So it cannot be the same. So there has to be some easy recommendations to give. And what I always say is that always when you have a mixed meal, try to make the complete sources the biggest contributors to that meal. So if an example, what I usually say sometimes is, if 2/3 of the protein amount is coming from a complete source, it's okay that the 1/3 is coming from an incomplete source. But if it's the other way around, it might not be as optimal to do.
I think that's terrific advice, and I think from a prescriptive standpoint, that makes a lot of sense. Pulling it back to the aging population, I'll just tell you about some data that we've collected but have never published. Again, using the example of the people that exercise in our center here, the women consume on average, and in North America, the breakfasts are very carbohydrate and obviously high fiber oriented, because that's the heart health hypothesis. Maybe a little different than in the Nordic countries, but when we surveyed those women, they consume on average about 8 grams of protein at breakfast, and 5 or 6 of those 8 grams comes from wheat gluten. So it's not a good source. It's not a high quality protein, and so you can call it protein, but it's really, I think, being minimally effective at stimulating muscle protein synthesis. And ultimately, I think that might be one of the reasons why older people are losing some muscle mass: anabolic resistance, less activity, lower quality protein, and in poor doses and not distributed well over the day. So again, that's a hypothesis, but one that we're hoping to try and make light of.
Okay. Would supplementing them with whey protein be an easy strategy to make sure that they consume enough protein?
Yeah, it's a convenient strategy. Again, the thing we constantly rub up against if we make those recommendations is the cost of whey protein. People on fixed incomes, it's not that it's a poor choice. I think it's a good choice. A lot of older people we have found they're resistant to change, and particularly if you ask them to buy something like whey that they're not familiar with, and it all depends. Some embrace the concept, no problem at all, but I do think that it's a little bit difficult to recommend the supplements for older people. Not impossible. There might be greater acceptance with the what we call the boomer or the young old generation who are coming through now, but definitely with the people we have in our center, it's been more of a food first approach, only because they're more comfortable. And that's where eggs, dairy, meat, cheese, that's where these things come in. And I know everybody says, oh, saturated fat, but if we're constantly pushing down on saturated fat, and I know your listeners are probably, I'm not going to go there. Okay. But if we constantly push down on saturated fat as a bad thing, then what we tend to cut out of people's food are these high quality, nutrient dense, nutrient rich protein sources. And that's, I think that's doing a real disservice to an older person, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Not going to go in on the topic of saturated fat, but I just have a comment on it, is that it always amazes me when we have these recommendations that you should limit the amounts of things that you should eat, that people try to eliminate them completely. Like, for example, red meat, you have a limitation of how much you should eat, and then people just assume that you should eliminate it completely from the source, and not realizing that it's actually a great source of protein, great source of vitamin B, great source of iron and zinc, and Yeah, it just amazes me. It always goes from this end and to the other end. There's no there's no gray areas.
Yeah, I agree completely. And, saturated fat and cholesterol are a couple of great examples of things that have, clearly been completely demonized and for a long period of time. And there was a lot of advice to cut them out, et cetera, et cetera. Now it seems to be, carbohydrates and particularly simple sugars, obviously, that are the bad. There's probably a moderate ground in this somewhere. But I agree. Extremes tend to appeal to people. They tend to be, polarizing and something people can rally around. And whatever the enjoyment is that people get out of doing that, clearly it's a little bit of anti-establishment stuff. So you either can eat some red meat or no red meat. And I'm with you. Nutrient dense, nutrient rich. You could argue about affordability, but I don't think that anywhere in the world that I've ever gone, I've ever seen that eggs have been unaffordable. They're always generally quite cheap. Mm-hmm. Dairy, depending on where you're going. Meat, again, very region specific, but in most westernized, or if you like, non-growing or well-developed economy countries, the meat supply tends to be fairly abundant.
Yeah, I agree.
And then I know we get into our environmental footprint, and I'm way out of my depth. So.
Okay, so to sum it all up, could you give us a take-home message on what we have been talking about?
Yeah, so I like to make things fairly simple. So I tell older people that the keys to successful aging really are to make sure that you maintain your mobility, however you do that. I advocate for resistance exercise. I understand it requires a little bit of planning, more so than recommending, go for a walk, for example. But I do think that there are obvious benefits associated with lifting weights. I talk about evenly spaced, nutrient-dense, high-quality protein sources. Try to hit 1.2. There may be benefits with higher intakes. I don't know if the evidence that I could cite to back that up, but I believe that, if you like. And definitely, the poem I like to quote is Dylan Thomas one, which says, "Rage against the dying of the light," right? So aging's going to get you, no question, but do as much as you can to slow the decline and try and live a full and healthful life, if you like.
Excellent. Now, Stu, where can people find more information about you? Are you active on social media?
Yeah. So I do a little bit on Twitter. You can follow me. I'm at MacKinProf. That's MacKinProf. I'm also on Facebook, Stuart Phillips. I have 2 pages, one that I'm, a little bit less active on, one that I use more sort of personally, but you can find me. I'm out there. I try and do a fair bit on social media. I get pulled back constantly into my academic world here, where the currency is to publish journal papers, of course, but I try and make as many of them open access. I try and give people access to our data. I'm probably on quite a few more academically focused but knowledge transfer media, like ResearchGate, for example. So you can find me on there. I apologize if somebody, I sent you this and you didn't reply. I was like, sorry, man.
Yeah.
I try.
Yeah. I would recommend all our listeners to follow Stu on Twitter. You have some great tweets there, and Brad Dieter also thinks that your tweets are an amazing alarm clock, since you have been waking him up for the last few months.
I was going to say, I listened to your podcast with Brad and I got a big chuckle out of that. So you know what, if you're going to get woken up by a tweet, I'm happy that it's mine. So that's a compliment, to be sure.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Thank you to all the listeners that listened on this podcast. If you don't know, this podcast is available in video format on YouTube, but you can also find it in audio format on iTunes as well. So Stu, thank you so much for being a guest on my podcast today. It was a pleasure to have you on, and I wish you a continued pleasant day.
Thanks very much, Jim. It was a real pleasure. Thanks for taking the time to have me on.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Okay, Stu. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.